Birds of prey have an interesting relationship to humans, having been both competing predators and avian companions for leisure pursuits. They've provided omens through the practice of augury or divination by flight pattern, and they appear in heraldic badges or also become associated with deities in mythology. But they also have links with ordinary people who shared the landscape with these fascinating hunters. Who wouldn't be stunned by the speed of an osprey as it accelerates towards the lake, pulling free of the water with a huge fish in its talons, or marvel at the flight prowess of a kestrel, hovering in mid-air even in the face of a gale. Indeed, kestrels enjoy the old nickname of wind hover thanks to their ability to hover despite weather conditions, and they're sometimes also called a stone gale, which might come from the phrase stand in gale, since they're able to withstand strong winds. Yes, birds of prey are definitely an impressive sight. So let's find out more about the folklore of red kites, falcons, hawks, buzzards, ospreys and shrikes in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with the theme of the folklore of birds after we had a look at aquatic birds last week, and this time we're going to be having a look at birds of prey. Now, I do have a bonus episode from 2021 on eagles, owls, red kites and falcons, but I am going to revisit falcons and red kites here while adding a little bit of extra folklore about them. There is so much about owls and eagles in the bonus episode that if you're interested, you might just simply want to revisit that. And you can do that by becoming a Patreon supporter at the £3.50 a month or more tier. So hopefully if you're interested, you can also access that. Plus the 50 odd other bonus episodes that there are, which do obviously include other birds as well. Now, obviously, I do want to acknowledge what's happening in the UK at the moment, and I try not to include politics where possible on the podcast, just because obviously that's not why a lot of people are listening. And also, people come to the episodes so much time after I've actually posted them. So I try not to kind of be particularly topical as much as I can. However, I think because of the just sheer nastiness and the violence that has been seen in the UK, and obviously that is where I am, it is therefore affecting my community. I obviously wanted to make a mention of it, particularly because there's been so much action sort of organised for today when this episode comes out. So obviously if you are going to any of the counter protests, please stay safe. And also just a quick reminder that obviously Fabulous Folklore stands against fascism of all kinds, because that's sort of the point of folklore. And I did have a bit of a wobble about this on Threads, that it almost seems frivolous to talk about folklore when there's major things happening in your part of the world. And Emma Catherine, who you might remember, who has been on the podcast as a guest before, did make the point that folklore is about connection both between people and people to where they are. So in the spirit of that, that is why we are going to be having a look at some folklore so that we can hopefully feel a little bit more connected to each other if possible. Now we are looking at birds of prey, which is an interesting one because one of them, you might go, why on earth have you included that one? But I will explain why when we get to it. But we are going to start off with red kites, which again is a little bit of a contentious inclusion because red kites are actually carrion birds, not birds of prey, but they're usually lumped in with birds of prey. And the reason why they're carrion birds is because they don't actually hunt things, they just eat dead carrion that they find. So they're not like eagles who go hunting, they're basically like nature's cleaners. And I always feel a lot like birds like this, like vultures are another example, get really reviled because they're performing this essential service. Now, red kites were actually made extinct in England until a reintroduction programme saw them gain in numbers both in Scotland and England. And part of the cause was the fact that people were either intentionally poisoning carrion to kill the birds, which makes no sense, or it was like accidental poisonings and so on. But because they do have this tendency to feed on carrion, it means that people did see them as inferior birds for a long time. And apparently there were so many of them in Shakespeare's London that they could be spotted actually feeding on refuse dumps and things like that. So if someone in Shakespeare's day called you a kite, and I think somebody does in King Lear, it was a huge insult. Now, surprisingly, despite the way people tended to revile the birds, they were actually protected by a royal decree thanks to their scavenging efforts, and they were believed that they helped to clean up the streets, which obviously that is entirely what they were doing. But they do have this slightly odd side to them as well, where they were believed to steal what's called lesser linen, which is usually known as underwear, that had been left out to dry. And basically red kites are sort of thieves, for want of a better word. And in 2009, the RSPB actually put out an article about the fact that they'd found all these weird items lining red kite nests, including England flags, magazine pages, tea towels, socks, handbags, frilly knickers, and even lottery tickets. And experts thought that they actually did that to show that the nest was in use, but it's just such a weird collection of things that they put together. It's obviously their kind of scavenging efforts, but we always think about other types of birds as building these fabulous nests out of things that they've found, but red kites just really seem to take that to a whole new level. Now, as much as we might find that funny, their pilfering nature is also pointed out as a negative trait in Aesop's fables, because in The Sick Kite, a kite is incredibly ill and he asks his mother to pray for help for him. Now, his mother replies that she can't, because he's stolen from the sacrifices to each of the gods, so now none of them will help him. Different versions offer slightly different morals, but the end result is much the same. Don't steal from people who may one day help you, which I think is probably quite good life advice. But not everyone had such negative connotations with the red kite, because in ancient Egypt, the goddess Isis was believed to be able to take the form of a kite to help resurrect the dead. According to Ernest Ingersoll's Birds in Legend, Fable and Folklore, the sacred scribes of Egypt also wore red caps bearing a kite's feather, and this was due to a tradition in which a kite brought the book of religious customs to Thebes. Now, they are truly magnificent birds if you ever do get to see them fly. I think I've only ever seen maybe 2 in the wild, and you can always tell them by that really distinctive tail that they've got. So it is good to see the reintroduction programme apparently working, because obviously they're not a competition. If you don't want birds of prey sort of stealing your grouse or whatever, a red kite isn't going to anyway, because they'd prefer something that's already dead. So it is quite nice to see that the reintroduction programme has been working. Now we are going to move on to a very different kind of bird, and this is probably more what people have in mind when you think of a bird of prey, and that's falcons. And peregrine falcons in particular are actually the fastest bird, and they can hit 30 miles an hour in normal flight and 70 miles an hour when hunting. And in a dive, they can get up to 200 miles an hour, which is obviously pretty fast. Now, a bit like owls, they are actually found on every continent except for Antarctica, and peregrine falcons in particular have quite a long and distinguished relationship with humans thanks to the practice of falconry. And again, I occasionally get them in my garden, and it's quite funny because you'll notice all of the little birds like sparrows and things have all disappeared, and you look out and then there'll be this like magnificent peregrine falcon like sitting on the top of the bird feeders or something. I've seen it in the back garden as well. It's always really bizarre to see one because you're like, you shouldn't be there, but essentially they built a housing estate across from where I live, so obviously where it used to hunt in the fields it now can't, so and obviously all the mice and things and the small birds have all been driven over into our housing estate, so hence we now have birds of prey, which I actually find really cool. But there we go. Now, speaking of falconry, according to medieval manuscripts, different social ranks were permitted to fly different types of birds. So, for example, kings could fly gerfalcons, princes had peregrines, goshawks were for yeomans, kestrels were for poorer men, and women could fly merlins. But that said, given the different hunting styles of birds, it's unlikely that anyone actually stuck to the hierarchy, because people would be more likely to fly the bird that actually suited the terrain. We get various phrases from falconry that we still use today. So, for example, someone being wrapped around your finger or under your thumb came from the leather straps that the falconer held to keep the bird on their glove. And hoodwinked comes from the hood put on the bird to keep it calm. And apparently even fed up comes from falconry, referring to birds that won't hunt because they're not actually hungry. Now, Greek divinate and dream interpreter Artemidorus explained that falcons represented good regal wives in dreams, so it's perhaps interesting to note that Anne Boleyn's heraldic badge featured a white falcon which represented both nobility and purity. Now, falcons were hunted during World War II due to the threat that they posed to carrier pigeons, and egg theft is a perennial threat to the species, and research also showed that the pesticide DDT caused them to lay eggs with incredibly thin shells, but the ban of DDT and various breeding programs has seen the recovery of the species. Falcons appear in ancient Egyptian, Greek and Norse mythology, and in ancient Egypt, Horus is the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky, and the sun is his right eye and the moon is his left. You also sometimes see the war god Montu with a falcon head in some depictions as well as the head of a bull. Now, in ancient Greece, falcons were sacred to Apollo, which might explain why Horus becomes linked with Apollo over time. But interestingly, while Athena is usually associated with the owl, in Homer's Odyssey she never actually takes an owl's form, but she does take the form of a falcon. And obviously the most famous example, I think, is probably in Norse mythology, where the goddess Freya takes the form of a falcon, using a falcon feathered cloak, and becoming a falcon lets her travel between worlds, which is pretty cool. And we're going to move on to hawks and buzzards, and I've decided to put these two together, partly because they're both in the same family, and partly because really there's not enough about buzzards to put them in separately, so I thought I'll just put them in together. And the names can actually be quite deceptive as well. So in the US you've got the red-tailed hawk and the Harris hawk, but they're actually buzzards, so it all gets a little bit confusing, so I thought I'll just put them together because it'll be easier. Now, hawks tend to live in woodlands and forests, which explains why they've got shorter wings and longer tails, because that gives them a lot more agility when they're flying between trees. And in the UK, our native species are the goshawk and the sparrowhawk, both of which have learned to hunt in cities after we decimated their woodlands. And again, we have had a sparrowhawk in the garden before. Now, buzzards, on the other hand, they tend to sort of stay a little bit further out and so on, and I've heard them over one of the local nature reserves, which is funny because hearing a buzzard cry apparently foretold rain or a storm. And I must admit, the time that I did hear a buzzard, it did rain later, but there we go, I'm not going to read too much into that. But in Norfolk, there would be 3 deaths in the house if you had a crow and a cuckoo land on a roof where a hawk was already perched. Now, this use of the hawk in divination actually has a really long history, with ancient augurs also paying attention to what birds did. And augury is essentially this practice where you look at a particular section of the sky and look at what direction birds are flying in and also which birds are flying. So if an augur spotted a hawk seizing and eating their prey within that patch of sky, it foretold death, although deliverance was at hand if the prey actually escaped. Now, at one point there was a belief that cuckoos turned into hawks for the winter, although that idea may have come about because of the fact that cuckoos look quite similar to sparrowhawks. And Edward Armstrong also notes an old belief that hoopoes turned into hawks, and that as both birds were solar birds in Egypt, it's possible that that idea of transformation somehow made its way to Britain as well. Now, hawks also appear in Norse myth, much like the falcon, and an all-seeing eagle perched on the top branch of Yggdrasil, and Ferdfrolnir, the hawk, sat between his eyes. I've probably completely mispronounced that, so I am sorry. No one is fully sure what the implication of this hawk really is. Now, the eagle appears in the Poetic Edda, which was put together in the 13th century from earlier sources, and it also appears in the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, but the hawk only really appears in the latter work. Eagles have tremendous eyesight, so it's really unclear why it would play host to a hawk as well. Sturluson himself doesn't actually explain it, but John Lindow theorised that the hawk was associated with the eagle's wisdom in particular. And there is also one story in which Odin takes the form of a hawk to escape someone, so it's entirely possible that they are actually all connected. For our penultimate bird, we're going to have a look at ospreys, and these are magnificent birds of prey that visit the British Isles in the summer and then they spend their winters in West Africa. And American listeners, you might know them as fish hawks, so they just simply have a slightly different name there. And their fishing prowess led to them being persecuted in earlier centuries in the UK, and they did go extinct. However, a pair bred in 1954 near Aviemore, and they've actually slowly made a recovery since then, and we do actually have them in Northumberland as well. And it's always lovely to know that they're building nests and they're still actually continuing and breeding and having families and everything. Now, their name comes from ossifraga, which means bone breaker in Latin, because people would sometimes find fragments of bone in their stomachs. And there's one particular old belief which actually sees the osprey charm the fish to offer themselves up for dinner. How this happens seems to vary dependent on the belief. So an American one that I had a look at seemed to think that the osprey released some kind of oil from its feathers and that made the fish come up to the surface. Others think it's just something that the osprey does, so it's quite interesting. And indeed, King James I attempted to train ospreys to fish for his benefit, which apparently you can actually do with cormorants, who we had a look at last week, but James tried it with ospreys, but apparently the ospreys were having none of it, so that particular experiment didn't work. In the Irish legend of the sons of Tuireann, 3 sons kill Lugh of the Long Hand's father. He gives them a list of impossible tasks as a punishment, and they must steal apples from the garden in the east of the world. Now, they do this in the form of hawks, but the local king's daughters take the form of ospreys and chase the brothers to the sea, and the sons only escape by becoming swans. So the way that birds become really important to that story is really interesting, but I love the fact that hawks are kind of seen as like one step down perhaps from ospreys, which obviously are then there as the hunters. Now, for our final bird, we're going to have a look at shrikes. Now, this one might seem like a bit of a weird inclusion because they're not exactly up there with the likes of eagles and owls as majestic birds of prey. They're also quite a rare sight in the British Isles, often only seen in autumn or winter. And to be fair, it's probably for the best that we don't see them very often for the fairly gross way that they kill their prey, because they hunt mice or voles and then impale them on thorn bushes, often leaving them for some time before they come back and tuck in. Now, Joe Wolfe explains that they don't have the right claws to actually hold onto their food like you see with eagles, so they have to make do with the thorns instead. And if any of you are the same sort of age as me and you remember the Animals of Farthing Wood, there was a particularly traumatic incident involving a shrike, and I think it was the pair of moles from the motley gang that were going to wherever it was they were going to, and that's always stuck with me, like in a really horrible way. So when I was looking at this, I was like, shall I include shrikes or not? So yeah, they are really unpleasant. But their tendency to build up a larder saw them nicknamed the butcher bird. And in medieval Britain, people also called them the Wariangle, which came from the Vergengel, or destroying angel in German, which is quite an interesting one. And Chaucer actually refers to them as Wariangles in the Friar's Tale. And also the redback shrike was referred to as the 9 killer, because some thought that it wouldn't eat any of its kills until it had amassed 9 of them, which kind of turns it into some kind of weird serial killer. But there we go. I just thought I would include that one because it's got these interesting things about its name and what its name represents, rather than any folklore about the bird particularly. But there we go. Yeah, I'm not a fan of them compared to the other ones. But there we go. As I say, I just thought because the names are quite interesting that I'd leave that one in. So what do we actually make of these birds of prey? And what I think we can see with them is the fact that obviously birds of prey to an extent could be seen as useful, as we see with falcons in particular. And obviously if you look at the folklore of eagles as well, you see how they very much get associated with like kings and royalty and so on. And then falcons have these quite regal associations as well. But then something like the red kite then becomes something that you use as an insult, apart from in ancient Egypt, because of the fact that they essentially clean up. So they're performing this really essential duty, which the other ones don't do, but they sort of get reviled for it anyway. And I think it's interesting how humans and birds of prey have had this quite close relationship throughout the years. And I think in some places like where I live, we do end up getting put back into contact with each other because of the fact that they're losing their habitat, so they have to come and hunt wherever they can. And for the smaller birds of prey, obviously a housing estate with all the small birds and so on that are knocking about makes actually quite a good hunting ground for them. There's plenty of places for them to perch. There's plenty of places for them to hunt. They're too big usually to be the object of prey for something like a cat, unlike obviously a lot of the garden birds that cats like to torment. So it's quite interesting to see how they have managed to find a place for themselves as well, which is quite cool. And then of course you've got the ones that are making a comeback who live out in the wilds and so on, who hopefully people have a little bit less to do with because we've not really got any reason to go and bother them. But I think that's why a lot of the folklore does see them perhaps used as omens because of that use in augury, but then they also have these really cool names associated with what it is that they actually do. Next week we're going to be having a look at garden birds. So we'll be looking at things like robins, because people have asked about those, although I will be talking about the European robin, which I've recently learned is different from the American one. We'll be looking at blackbirds, which are one of my absolute favourites. Wrens will be in there because wrens are really funny, and various different birds like that as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy the garden birds episode. The last thing that I actually wanted to say is that I am teaching a 4-week class with Morbid Anatomy starting on the 11th of August, looking at ghost stories and ghosts and things. So we will be having a look at a little bit of like what is folklore, how do ghost stories actually fit in with folklore, how can you evaluate the folklore information that you come across, because obviously some of it is of dubious quality or dubious origin. And then we'll be looking at ghost stories, where did they actually come from, how did they develop, and then how does that feed into how people use ghost stories now through things like ghost investigation. And then we will also be collecting ghost stories to then share those for a little bit of folklore and action at the end. So as I say, it does start on the 11th of August. It is 7 p.m. till 9 p.m. in the UK, which obviously is like 2 till 4 in Eastern time. And replays will be available if anyone can't attend live. And it would be really lovely to see some of you there if ghosts are your thing, because I think you've probably realised by now they are definitely mine. And the link for that is in the show notes. But otherwise, it's been lovely chatting to you as always. So I'll see you next week when we'll have a look at garden birds. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, So if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.